If I asked you to build a machine, right, like a literal machine designed to isolate, marginalize, and punish a very specific group of people.
That is a pretty dark thought experiment to start us off with.
I know, I know. It's intense. But stick with me here.
Yeah.
If I told you this machine had to run continuously for, well, over 2,000 years, how would you even do it?
Well, you certainly couldn't just rely on an angry mob.
Exactly. Because mobs get tired, people eventually just, go home.
Right, emotions cool down.
Yeah. To make prejudice last across millennia, you would need something much more durable than just simple human anger.
You'd need a self-sustaining engine.
A system so deeply embedded in the daily operations of society that people wouldn't even realize they were tuning the gears.
Which is a terrifying concept.
It really is.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. Today we are looking at a fascinating, highly structured document. It's this massive stack of research and historical analysis.
And it essentially acts as a set of blueprints for exactly that kind of machine.
Right. And looking at blueprints requires a very specific kind of attention from you, the listener.
It does, because when you look at the architecture of a machine, you aren't looking at the weather. You aren't looking at a force of nature.
You're looking at deliberate, calculated design, which, that totally flips how we usually think about this topic.
Oh, absolutely.
Because usually when we talk about history or when we look back at the darker chapters of how human beings treat one another.
Especially regarding LGBTQ plus individuals.
Yes, specifically that. We tend to think of it as a purely emotional phenomenon, like a wildfire.
Right. We assume prejudice is just this chaotic, irrational hatred.
Like it just flares out of nowhere, burns through society, and then eventually it fizzles out when people learn better. We treat it like a tragic accident of human nature.
But the mission of our deep dive today is to look at this history not as a series of random tragic events.
Exactly. We want to understand the cold structural mechanics behind it, because the document we're analyzing reveals a rather chilling reality.
It really does. It shows that while the specific targets, the language, and the excuses change over the centuries,
the underlying mechanism of this prejudice is identical. It's the same engine, just bolted into a different chassis over and over again.
Before we really get into the gears and levers of this, though, I want to establish a very clear ground rule for you listening to this right now.
Yeah, that's crucial.
The source material we are unpacking today deals with deeply charged cultural, political, and historical conflicts.
It touches on theology, modern culture wars, identity.
All the heavy stuff.
Uh-huh.
And my role today, well, our role today is not to endorse specific viewpoints.
Right. We are definitely not here to take sides in modern political debates.
Or to tell you what to believe about gender or sexuality. Our job is purely to unpack and impartially analyze the profound historical and psychological frameworks presented in this text.
We are just observers of the architecture. We're asking, how does the text say this machine works? Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the machine, we have to look at how it was constructed over time.
Right.
You can't just look at the present day.
No, you have to look at the historical assembly line.
Right. And the document lays out this incredibly detailed timeline. They call it an era matrix.
And that matrix proves a vital point. The justification for prejudice constantly updates itself to match whatever the dominant power structure of the time happens to be.
So the resulting action against the group stays the exact same, but the excuse mutates.
Precisely. So let's start at the beginning. The text takes us all the way back to the ancient and classical worlds.
So we're talking Rome, Greece, the Mediterranean empires prior to roughly 300 CE.
Right. And the first thing the document clarifies about the ancient world is that the concept of an LGBTQ plus identity, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist.
Like it wasn't even a category in their minds.
Not in the way we frame it now, no. There was no centralized, overarching moral system enforcing a strict universal binary of sexuality.
Right. Same-sex behavior existed openly in many of these societies.
But it wasn't identity-based.
Wait, let me make sure I'm tracking this. So it wasn't a case of you are gay or you are straight as a fundamental category of human being.
Not at all. It was entirely role-based. The text points out that prejudice in this era was tied to status violations.
Status violations, okay.
Yeah, particularly regarding rigid expectations of masculinity and citizenship. In ancient Rome, for instance, the societal concern wasn't about the gender of your partner.
It was about the power dynamic.
Exactly. It was about whether a citizen man was taking a dominant or a passive role.
And taking a passive role was the issue.
For a citizen, yes. It was framed as feminized, weak, or dishonorable. It basically meant you were allowing yourself to be treated like someone of a lower social class.
Wow. That is such a crucial distinction to wrap our heads around. It's entirely about hierarchy.
It is. The prejudice isn't you are doing something unnatural. The prejudice is you have violated your rank in society.
You were voluntarily giving up your dominance.
Yes. And the emotion driving that prejudice was shame, not fear. It was a failure of civic status.
So you were mocked or socially demoted, but you weren't generally viewed as, like, a threat to the cosmos.
Right. But, an empire can't survive on social shaming alone.
Especially once it gets too big and too diverse.
Exactly. Once it starts fracturing, you need something stronger. Which leads us to the first major update of the machine.
The religious consolidation era.
Roughly 300 to 1500 CE.
So we're talking the fall of Rome, the rise of the Byzantine Empire, and the massive spread of monotheism across Europe and the Middle East.
And the machine gets a massive software update.
A complete overhaul, right?
Totally. The sources show that as these massive early empires fragmented, rulers and societies realized they needed a much stronger glue to hold everything together.
And what's stronger than social shame?
Divine law.
Right. You have the rise and institutionalization of organized monotheistic religions.
These societies were desperately trying to stabilize themselves. They needed moral uniformity to maintain social control across vast, largely uneducated populations.
So the target suddenly shifts.
It does. It's no longer about whether you are a dominant citizen or a passive citizen. The primary focus becomes the behavior itself.
Specifically, men engaging in same-sex acts. The text notes that sodomy becomes a codified legal and religious category.
And the framing completely changes. It's no longer just dishonorable.
It becomes sinful, becomes unnatural.
Something punishable not just by mockery in the public square, but by divine wrath.
And pay attention to the emotional driver there, because the document notes that the emotion shifts from simple societal shame to profound moral disgust.
Coupled with the terrifying fear of divine punishment, prejudice becomes moralized.
And more importantly, it becomes institutionalized.
Yes. The theological logic the text outlines is that a creator made a natural order, sex is strictly for reproduction within a specific family structure, and non-reproductive acts are a literal disorder.
They're viewed as a tear in the fabric of the universe.
Right. A tear that could bring famine, plague, or destruction down on the entire community.
That's a massive escalation. I mean, it goes from you are embarrassing yourself to you are going to bring a plague upon our village.
Precisely. Because the stakes of societal control were raised. But history marches on, and the power centers shift yet again.
We enter the early modern period, say the 1500s to the 1800s.
The dominance of the centralized church starts to share the stage.
And in some places, entirely lose the stage to the rise of the nation state.
Kings, parliaments, the beginnings of complex national bureaucracies, and the machine updates again.
Because the state realizes, hey, we can't just let the local priests handle social order. We need centralized earthly authority.
That is exactly the political physics at play here. This is a period of intense state formation.
Governments are trying to assert order, discipline, and population control.
They need to manage their citizens to build armies, collect taxes, and maintain civil obedience. So the framing shifts from a religious sin to a state crime.
See, that's a terrifying pivot. Because a sin is between you and the divine, or maybe you and your local religious community. But a crime means the state now has the jurisdiction to kick down your door. How did governments practically enforce that shift?
Through the creation of standardized legal codes and secular courts. You see the intensification of sodomy laws enforced by civil magistrates and police forces.
So it's not just religious tribunals anymore.
Exactly. It becomes about public punishment, imprisonment, the pillory, executions managed directly by the state.
And the justification the text highlights is no longer solely about divine wrath.
No, it's about secular social order. The narrative pushed by the state is that moral deviance leads to civic chaos.
And the state must protect the public from chaos.
Yes. Prejudice transforms into a calculated tool of state-enforced control.
Which brings us to what the document highlights as perhaps the most pivotal, fundamental shift in the entire timeline, the 19th and early 20th century.
The text flags this as a critical moment because this is the birth of identity.
Right. Up until this point, the focus was overwhelmingly on the act. You committed a sin or you committed a crime.
But with the 19th century comes the rise of the Industrial Revolution, the birth of modern medicine, the rise of the clinic.
And a profound societal desire to categorize, measure, and catalog everything in the natural world.
Including human beings. The focus shifts from the act to the person. LGBTQ plus becomes an identity.
The logic changes from you are a person who did a bad thing to you are a fundamentally different defective type of person.
And the framing mutates again. We enter the era of medicalization.
The label changes from you are sinful or you are a criminal to you are sick, you are a degenerate.
And I want to pause here because the text mentions concepts like pseudoscience and eugenics, which are very heavy terms.
Yeah, for listeners who might only know the word vaguely from high school history class, what exactly is eugenics and how did it apply here?
Well, eugenics was a widely accepted, highly influential pseudoscience in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
It was treated as mainstream science at the time, right?
Oh, absolutely. It essentially claimed that human behavioral traits, including morality, criminality, and sexuality, were entirely biological and hereditary.
So built into your DNA before DNA was fully understood.
Exactly. The core idea was that you could and should, quote unquote, breed better human populations by encouraging the fit to reproduce and weeding out the unfit or undesirable traits.
It was literally an attempt to apply agricultural breeding concepts to human society.
Yes. So under that framework, someone engaging in same-sex behavior wasn't just breaking a law, they were viewed as biologically defective.
They were seen as carrying a biological taint that threatened the evolutionary health of the entire species.
And the tools used to enforce this prejudice change accordingly. It's no longer just the priest or the judge doing the enforcing.
It's the psychiatrist, the medical doctor, the asylum director.
Right. The prejudice becomes rationalized through the language of science.
And the emotion the public feels shifts toward a clinical pity, mixed with this intense fear of biological contamination.
And the dominant groups enforcing this convince themselves they're not being hateful. They genuinely believe they are being objective, biological, and scientific.
It's incredible how the excuse shifts to whatever society worships at the highest altar of the time.
What's fascinating here is that clear progression.
Yeah. Like in the religious era, society worshipped divine law, so the excuse was theological. In the early modern era, society worshipped the authority of the state, so the excuse was legal.
And in the 19th century, society worshipped science and biology, so the excuse was medical.
It's honestly like a computer virus.
Walk us through that analogy.
Okay, think about how a sophisticated computer virus works. The outer shell of the virus constantly mutates to trick the antivirus software, right?
Yeah, valid.
It disguises itself as a religious text file, then it mutates into an executable legal file, then it disguises itself as a scientific diagnostic program.
Right, it changes its code just enough to bypass society's current intellectual immune system.
Exactly. But the payload it delivers, the marginalization, the exclusion, the punishment, is exactly the same payload every single time.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the document's thesis. The outer shell updates, the payload remains.
And we see this rapid mutation clearly as we move into the mid-20th century.
Right. This is an era defined by global conflict, the aftermath of World War II, the rise of the Cold War, and intense, hyper-vigilant nationalism.
Society is gripped by the fear of instability, espionage, and infiltration.
So simply calling someone sick is no longer a sufficient framing for the virus. The state needs to mobilize the public.
The virus mutates into a security threat. The narrative becomes deviant equals dangerous.
The document points to specific historical examples here, like the Nazi persecution marked by the pink triangle.
And in the United States, something called the Lavender Scare.
Yes.
Can you unpack the Lavender Scare for us? I mean, we all know about the Red Scare and the hunt for communists, but what was the specific mechanism of the Lavender Scare?
Well, during the Cold War, particularly in the 1950s under McCarthyism in the U.S., the government became absolutely obsessed with the idea of internal subversion.
Right.
The Red Scare was about rooting out communists. The Lavender Scare was a parallel state-sponsored purge of homosexual employees from the federal government.
But what was the justification?
The justification here was a clinical, terrifyingly pragmatic piece of political physics. The logic went like this. Homosexuality is a moral weakness and a societal secret.
Okay.
Therefore, if you are a gay government employee, you are vulnerable to blackmail by Soviet agents.
Because they could threaten to out you.
Exactly. So to protect state secrets, you must be fired, publicly outed, and your career destroyed.
Wow. So prejudice becomes intrinsically tied to national loyalty and state security. You aren't just a sinner or a patient. You are a traitor waiting to happen.
Yes. The emotional driver is sheer geopolitical paranoia.
Which sets the stage for the final era in the Matrix.
Right.
The late 20th century to the present.
The era of visibility. The AIDS crisis, the civil rights movements, and the subsequent culture wars.
Suddenly, the targeted group is organizing. They are rejecting the medical labels, rejecting the criminal labels, and demanding basic civic rights.
The identities expand in the public consciousness. And because the group is visible and demanding integration, the battlefield shifts one more time.
It shifts away from outright criminalization and state-mandated institutionalization and moves into the realm of cultural and political conflict.
Right. The battlegrounds become marriage, healthcare access, and gender identity recognition in schools.
And the narrative reverts, in some ways, to an existential panic. The rhetoric becomes, they are a threat to children, or they are an attack on the very definition of the family.
And the justification is all about protecting tradition and what the text calls biological essentialism, the idea that traditional gender roles are immutable laws of nature.
So looking at this entire era matrix, what does the document identify as the underlying constant?
Across all of these eras, from Roman status to religious sin to state crime to medical disease to national security threat to cultural panic, the target shifts, the language shifts, but the trigger remains identical.
A society feels a deep systemic need for stability and control.
Yes, and they project their anxieties onto this group, identifying them with the feeling of, this group disrupts the system we rely on.
Okay, I hear that, and I see the historical pattern, but this brings up a huge question for me, and I'm sure for you listening as well.
What's the question?
If we look at this objectively, analyzing the actual physical history of the world, did this group ever actually threaten a society's resources or physical survival? Were LGBTQ plus people historically hoarding the grain supply? Were they staging armed rebellions to overthrow the kings? Were they poisoning the wells?
Right. The text asks this profound question, and it concludes with a definitive empirical no.
Exactly. The document is very explicit about the material conditions of history. LGBTQ plus individuals, as a demographic, did not meaningfully threaten the natural resources, the economic dominance, or the physical survival of any of these empires or states.
The threat was almost entirely symbolic.
See, I have to push back on this on behalf of our listeners. Let's really stress test this premise.
Let's do it.
If this group wasn't hoarding resources or causing physical harm, why did massive, powerful empires, societies that had real problems like famine, war, and plague to deal with, spend so much energy, ink, and blood persecuting them?
That's a fair question.
Why write thousands of pages of sprawling legal codes, build elaborate theological frameworks, and invent entire fields of pseudoscience to combat a purely symbolic threat? That seems like an irrational waste of state resources. Why the extreme systemic reaction to a symbol?
That is the essential question of the entire text. To answer it, the document breaks down what it calls the trigger layer and the concept of cultural friction.
Cultural friction, okay.
The answer lies in the fact that human societies don't just run on material goods. They don't just run on food, water, and steel.
They run on operating systems.
Yes. Foundational beliefs, intangible rules. And LGBTQ plus individuals, simply by existing naturally, disrupted the foundational operating system of these societies.
The core identity architecture. The invisible code that tells everyone how to behave.
Exactly. Think about the load-bearing pillars of human civilization for the last few millennia.
Rules like men must perform labor X and behave in manner A.
Women must perform labor Y and behave in manner B.
The family unit must be structured exactly like Z to pass down property and wealth.
These aren't just minor lifestyle guidelines. These are the structural pillars of how a society organizes labor, manages inheritance, and creates social predictability.
By existing outside of these non-reproductive, non-traditional gender roles, this demographic symbolized ambiguity.
They introduced fluidity into a system that demanded absolute, rigid certainty.
Let me try an analogy here to ground this for you listening. It's like walking into a massive banquet hall where thousands of people are playing a very serious, high-stakes game of chess.
Okay, I picture it.
Everyone knows the rules. The knights move like this, the bishops move like that. If you win, you get status. If you lose, you suffer.
The stakes are high.
Right. Then you walk in, you sit down at a board, and you start playing checkers with the pieces.
Oh, I like this.
You aren't hurting anyone physically. You aren't stealing the board. You aren't taking anyone's food. But you are causing intense, blinding anxiety in the room because you are proving, just by sitting there, that the rules everyone else is rigidly, painfully following might actually be completely made up.
That's a brilliant way to visualize it. You are exposing the artificiality of the game. And the text introduces a deeper cut theory here, which is vital to understanding the scale of the persecution.
What's the deeper cut?
It talks about problem substitution and identity through opposition.
Let's unpack those. Problem substitution first.
Think about a society experiencing massive internal stress. Maybe the traditional gender roles are actually making a large portion of the population miserable.
Or maybe the economic structure is failing and the peasants are starving.
Maybe there's massive wealth inequality or a lost war. Confronting the actual flaws or constraints in their own rigid systems is incredibly difficult.
It requires the people in power to give up power. It requires admitting the system is broken.
And that is deeply destabilizing. So instead of fixing the complex, terrifying structural problems, society redirects the tension. They
Yes.
substitute the problem.
They say the system isn't broken, the system is perfect and divine. The only reason you are unhappy or the crops are failing is because of these specific people who are deviating from the perfect system.
Precisely. It is a psychological pressure relief valve for a failing society. And this leads directly into the second concept, identity through opposition.
How does that work?
Well, how does a society define what is normal and moral? It is philosophically very difficult to define goodness in a vacuum.
Right, you need a contrast.
The easiest, most efficient way for a dominant society to define us, the moral, upright majority, is by aggressively, violently rejecting them.
By persecuting the outlier, the majority reassures itself of its own righteousness.
You define the boundaries of your community by pointing to the people you've thrown outside the city walls.
I think we can all relate to this on a micro level. Let's bring this down from the Roman Empire to everyday psychology. Think about your own life, listener. Human beings inherently crave predictable life scripts.
We really do.
Society hands you a script. You go to school, you get a job, you marry a specific kind of person, you buy a house, you have kids, you retire.
We like the script because it's safe. It outsources our decision-making.
It tells us what to do to be considered successful.
But then what happens?
When someone walks into your life and totally deviates from that script,
Yeah.
maybe they don't want to get married, maybe their gender expression doesn't match the script, maybe they structure their family entirely differently.
And crucially, they are happy doing it.
Yes, it triggers a deep systemic anxiety in a lot of people.
Because it forces a mirror onto the observer.
Exactly. Why are they anxious?
Yeah.
Because it implies the rules we all sacrifice so much to follow, the parts of ourselves we repress to fit into the script, might be constructed.
They might not be absolute laws of nature.
And if the rules aren't absolute, then all the sacrifices we made to follow them might have been optional. That is a terrifying existential thought for a lot of people.
It breeds resentment. I follow the rules and I'm miserable. How dare you break the rules and be happy?
It is existentially terrifying.
Yeah.
And when a society, at scale, faces existential terror, it doesn't just sit with that discomfort.
No, it builds a machine to eliminate the source of the terror.
Which brings us to the actual architecture of the prejudice machine itself. How does that abstract societal discomfort turn into a durable, centuries-long institution?
Because discomfort is just a feeling. You need infrastructure to make it last.
The text breaks this down into three escalating layers: the narrative layer, the system layer, and the justification layer.
Let's walk through these slowly because this is the core blueprint. The first layer is the narrative layer, the framing.
This is where you have to convince the public that the target isn't just different, but actively dangerous.
Right. How is the group turned into a story? Prejudice spreads at scale when a group is framed in the public imagination as a meaningful threat.
So dominant institutions ask themselves, often unconsciously, how to make prejudice emotionally believable to the average farmer or factory worker.
So they craft narratives designed to bypass the logical brain and trigger specific primal emotions: fear, disgust, moral panic.
What do those narratives look like in practice?
They frame the group as unnatural, diseased, predatory, or a threat to children. Notice that these narratives almost never rely on actual statistical data or genuine threat assessment.
They rely on triggering evolutionary anxieties about contamination or social collapse.
Exactly. If you can make a population feel disgust, you don't need to provide them with data.
If we use a modern business analogy, the narrative layer is the marketing campaign.
That's a great way to put it.
It's the billboard, the commercial, the viral tweet that makes you afraid of a product, or in this case, a demographic of people. It hooks your emotions. It creates the demand for prejudice.
But a marketing campaign isn't enough on its own. A billboard can't put someone in jail.
You need the second layer, the system layer, the normalization.
This is where bias stops being an opinion you hold in your head and becomes a physical structure in the real world. A hateful idea can fade in a single generation, but a system, a bureaucracy, can reproduce itself indefinitely.
The system layer is about how prejudice is embedded into state laws, church doctrine, school rules, military exclusion policies, and media censorship guidelines.
The mechanics of it.
Exactly. It's the sodomy laws written into the penal code. It's the psychiatric classifications printed in medical textbooks.
It's the employment blacklists. It's the incredibly mundane bureaucratic ways that ordinary people are incentivized to participate.
Either through reporting their neighbors to the authorities or just staying silent to protect their own jobs.
Continuing our analogy, if the narrative layer is the marketing campaign that makes you afraid, the system layer is the supply chain that delivers the punishment.
It's the logistics of discrimination. The trucks, the warehouses, the HR departments, the courtrooms, it's the people stamping the forms.
But even then, human beings generally want to feel like they are good people.
Yeah, nobody thinks they're the bad guy.
Even people operating a cruel supply chain don't want to look in the mirror and think of themselves as villains. So you need the final stabilizing layer, the justification layer, the rationalization.
This is the layer that provides psychological comfort to the majority.
This is how people convince themselves the prejudice is not only acceptable, but morally righteous. It's where raw discomfort gets upgraded into respected doctrine.
The text shows how societies use their most serious and respected frameworks, theology, law, medicine, evolutionary biology, sociology, to make discrimination feel like common sense.
Give me an example of how that rationalization works in a loop.
Okay, it relies heavily on circular logic. For example, a society might say, these people are marginalized, therefore they live in poverty, or they have to meet in secret underground spaces.
Right.
Look at their poverty and secrecy. That proves they are inherently inferior, deceitful, and untrustworthy. Therefore, our policy of marginalizing them is completely justified.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The justification layer is what allows a society or a judge or a doctor to say, I'm not being hateful or bigoted. History, God, science, and the natural order are on my side.
The justification layer is the terms and conditions. It's the dense legal fine print that helps everyone sleep at night.
It says actually being cruel to this specific group is a virtue. You are protecting society.
It's a remarkably robust machine when you look at all three parts: marketing, supply chain, terms and conditions, narrative, system, justification.
And here, to really understand how this machine survives, we have to introduce what the text calls the constraint layer.
Because the natural, optimistic question anyone reading history asks is, if this was happening, if this threat was fundamentally an illusion, why didn't more people stop it?
Why didn't ordinary, decent people jam the gears of the machine?
Yeah, surely over 2,000 years, millions of people saw through the marketing campaign. They saw their neighbor, who was targeted by this machine, and thought, wait, Dave isn't a threat to the cosmos. Dave just wants to farm his land.
Many people absolutely did see through it, but the constraint layer explains why resistance so often failed to materialize at scale.
First, the sheer brutal cost of dissent.
If you spoke out against the machine, you risked social exile, loss of livelihood, or legal danger. You risked having the machine turn its gaze on you.
Labeling you with the very same stigma or calling you a sympathizer?
Self-preservation kicks in.
Yes, but there's a more profound, subtle constraint at work. The system normalized the prejudice to such an extreme degree that to the average citizen, it didn't even feel like prejudice anymore.
It just felt like tradition or the way the world works.
When discrimination is embedded in the law you obey, validated by the church you attend, and confirmed by the doctor you trust, the average citizen defers to that overwhelming authority.
They substitute their own moral intuition with the authority of the institution. Normalization plus risk equals silence. It's a clinical sociological formula.
That brings us to a really uncomfortable reality. We keep talking about this as a machine, but systems don't run themselves. Blueprints don't build buildings. People do.
We have to look at the human element. Who is actually pulling the levers?
The text categorizes the specific actors who enforce prejudice. And it's critical to note that it's not just a monolith of evil people twirling their mustaches.
It's a complex ecosystem of human motivations. It's vital to break this down because treating perpetrators as a single uniform block of hatred is weak analysis.
It blinds you to how systems actually operate.
The text identifies 5 distinct types of actors. First, you have the true believers.
The zealots.
Yes, these are the individuals genuinely deeply motivated by ideology, religion, or a rigid worldview.
They truly, in their bones, believe the group is immoral, defective, or dangerous.
They are enforcing divine or natural order as they see it. They provide the passionate energy for the machine.
But there are rarely enough true believers to run a whole society. So you need the second group, the institutional enforcers.
Right. These are people who are just doing their job. The judges applying the law, the doctors using the diagnostic manual, the bureaucrats stamping the forms, the police making the arrests.
They carry out the policies regardless of their own deep personal beliefs.
Their motivation isn't necessarily hatred. It's duty, career advancement, a paycheck, or simple obedience to bureaucratic authority.
This is the banality of evil concept, right? The idea that massive systemic harm doesn't require psychopaths. It just requires a bureaucrat who wants a promotion and doesn't want to rock the boat.
Precisely. They are shielded from feeling moral guilt because the bureaucracy absorbs the responsibility. I didn't make the law, I just enforce it.
Then we have the third group, which from an analytical standpoint is perhaps the most fascinating and destructive, the opportunists.
The opportunists use the existing fear and prejudice to gain power, votes, wealth, or social leverage. They exploit the bias for personal gain.
I really want to hone in on this one. Explain to the listener how a politician, a media figure, or an influencer might not actually harbor any deep personal hatred toward LGBTQ plus people in their private life, but they use the machine publicly anyway simply because it works. How does that political physics operate?
To understand the opportunist, we have to look at the psychological mechanics the text outlines. Opportunists are master manipulators of human cognitive biases.
They understand in-group and out-group dynamics perfectly.
They know that human beings have a deep-seated fear of the unknown, and when under stress, a desperate need for cognitive shortcuts.
What do you mean by cognitive shortcuts?
When a society is facing complex, deeply difficult problems, say massive economic stagnation, rapid technological change that is displacing workers, or global pandemics, the public feels a profound loss of control.
The actual solutions to those problems are boring, complex, and require shared sacrifice.
An opportunist steps in and offers a cognitive shortcut. They say, the world isn't complex, it's actually very simple. You, the listener, are the good, pure in-group. All your complex problems are actually caused by the existence of this specific, strange, deviant out-group.
They sell a scapegoat. It's a narrative product that provides emotional relief.
Exactly. It replaces complex anxiety with a simple sense of control and moral superiority. And the opportunist exploits what the text calls the feedback loop to maintain this power.
Walk us through the steps of that feedback loop.
Step 1. An opportunist amplifies a fear-based narrative about the targeted group to gain attention or votes.
Step 2. That narrative leads to the creation of systemic laws, marginalizing the group, defunding their health care, or pushing them out of public life.
Step 3. That systemic marginalization creates real-world negative outcomes for the group.
Because they are marginalized, they experience higher rates of poverty, mental health struggles, homelessness, or, as we saw historically in the 1980s, the unchecked devastation of the AIDS crisis.
Step 4. The opportunist then points to those tragic, systemically created outcomes and uses them as proof that the group is inherently flawed, diseased, or dangerous.
See, look at the disease in their community. Look at the instability. I was right to warn you about them all along.
Exactly. The narrative justifies the system produces the tragic outcomes, and the outcomes reinforce the narrative. It is a closed, perfectly efficient loop.
And the opportunist rides that loop straight to political or social power. It is a clinical calculus.
It's a staggering piece of political machinery.
But those three groups, believers, enforcers, opportunists, still need the cooperation of the masses. Which leads us to the final two types of actors who make up the vast majority of the public, the fearful followers.
These are the people who participate out of social pressure. They might not hate anyone, they might even have a gay family member they love.
But they want to belong to the safe majority. Or they are terrified of being targeted next if they step out of line, so they laugh at the joke, they vote for the policy, they look the other way.
And finally, the passive bystanders. The people who don't actively harm anyone, but they allow the system to continue through sheer apathy, exhaustion, or a feeling of helplessness.
When you put all five of those together, the fiery believers, the bureaucratic enforcers, the calculating opportunist, the follower, and the bystander, you have a fully functioning, self-sustaining, prejudice machine.
It doesn't require everyone to be filled with hatred. It just requires everyone to play their specific role in the ecosystem.
And that profound realization leads us directly into the modern era, because the dynamics of this machine become even more complex today due to a phenomenon the text identifies as the visibility paradox.
Right. We transition to the late 20th century and the present day. The targeted group is no longer hiding in the shadows.
They are highly visible, legally organized in many places, and integrated into everyday society. Now, the logical assumption would be that more visibility automatically equals less prejudice. Right?
Because people realize, oh, they're just normal people going to the grocery store, paying taxes, and walking their dogs.
But the source document states clearly, as visibility increases, understanding can increase, but backlash always increases. Why the inevitable backlash?
If we connect this back to our earlier discussion about the operating system of society, it makes perfect sense.
More visibility means the perceived disruption of those traditional norms is now impossible to ignore.
It's in the public square, it's on television, it's in the curriculum at schools.
The people who deeply rely on rigid traditional systems for their sense of safety feel their identity architecture is under constant visible threat.
But the text offers a brilliant, highly specific breakdown of exactly how modern opposition narratives function to trigger and weaponize this backlash today, specifically through a mechanism it calls the extreme amplification loop.
This is such a critical concept for anyone consuming media today, regardless of the topic. How does this amplification loop work in practice?
The text acknowledges a very simple statistical reality. Within any massive social movement or demographic group, there are fringe behaviors, highly provocative expressions, and extreme viewpoints.
That is true of any large group of humans on Earth.
However, modern opposition narratives, often driven by opportunists and fueled by algorithms, do not focus on the mundane, ordinary reality of the 99% of the group.
Instead, they capture the most highly visible, emotionally provocative extremes.
Give me an example of what they are capturing.
It might be a highly controversial avant-garde performance art piece. It might be a radically provocative activist slogan.
Or it might be a highly complex, nuanced debate happening at the absolute fringes of medical policy.
The machine captures these extremes, strips them of all context, and presents them to the general public as completely representative of the entire group's daily life and agenda.
It's the ultimate cognitive trap. Let me use an analogy to highlight how absurd but effective this is.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine you are trying to understand what daily life is like in a massive, complex city, let's say New York or Tokyo.
Sure.
But the only information you are ever given, the only thing fed to your screen, is a viral video of the most eccentric, chaotic person screaming on a street corner at 2000 a.m.
If you watch that video 10 times a day, you're going to think, wow, that entire city is a terrifying, collapsing madhouse. I need to protect my family from that city.
You completely ignore the millions of people quietly riding the subway, drinking their coffee, going to work, and doing their laundry.
The amplification loop is effective because the human brain is inherently lazy. It prefers simple, shocking categories over complex, boring reality.
That is exactly the mechanism. It provides an illusion of evidence. It confirms existing fears.
If a parent is already slightly anxious about changing gender norms in society, showing them an extreme, out-of-context, highly provocative example serves as undeniable proof that their fear is justified.
It completely collapses nuance. It allows the viewer to say, I don't need to read a sociological study or talk to my gay neighbor to understand this community. I've seen this one shocking video online, and that tells me everything I need to know.
It strengthens the narrative layer of fear and disgust, which in turn fuels the justification layer to pass new restrictive laws.
I want to ask you, the listener, to do a mental audit right now. Have you ever noticed this in your own social media feeds?
Have you noticed how extreme, polarizing examples of any group, political, social, or religious, are constantly fed to you?
Algorithms do this not because the algorithm has a political agenda, but because it is programmed to maximize engagement.
And nothing keeps human beings engaged like primal outrage and fear. But in doing so, the algorithm replaces the boring, ordinary, complex reality of a massive demographic with a cartoonish, terrifying caricature.
And the text explicitly warns against falling for this. It says that treating LGBTQ plus people, or any marginalized group, as a monolith is a total analytical failure.
The machine wants you to confuse a person's fundamental identity with a specific ideology or a specific political behavior or a specific provocative subculture.
Identity is who someone is. Behavior or ideology is what they do or believe.
If you blend those together, assuming every person in the demographic shares the exact same radical political agenda, you are falling for the propaganda of the machine.
Which brings us to the final major section of the text, the ecosystem of the targeted group itself.
Because if we establish that the targeted group is not a monolith, we have to look at how they actually respond to this 2,000-year-old machine.
Exactly. We have to look at agency. When a group is targeted by a historically entrenched prejudice machine, they don't just stand there passively and take it.
They organize. They build their own structures.
But the text highlights that modern LGBTQ plus organizations are not pushing one single unified secret agenda from a shadowy boardroom.
They are a diverse, fractured, complex ecosystem of different strategies, often heavily disagreeing with one another.
The document breaks down this ecosystem by function, which I think is the best way to analyze how a group pushes back against power. First, you have the legal and policy organizations.
Groups like Lambda Legal, or the Human Rights Campaign in the U.S., their focus is almost entirely on dismantling the system layer.
They wear suits, they fight in the appellate courts, they lobby for civil rights legislation, they work to change the literal, physical laws and corporate structures that enforce discrimination.
They are fighting the bureaucracy with bureaucracy.
They are attacking the supply chain of the machine. Methodical, slow, legal work.
But changing a law doesn't instantly heal a person, which leads to the second group, the health and support organizations.
Groups like the Trevor Project, their focus is fighting what the text calls the legacy layer.
Even when laws change and the system layer is dismantled, the historical trauma, the internalized stigma, the psychological impacts of centuries of prejudice remain embedded in the population.
The suicide rates, the family rejection, these groups are the medics on the battlefield. They're trying to heal the psychological damage the machine leaves behind in its wake.
Then we have the advocacy and media groups.
Organizations like GLAD, their entire focus is on rewriting the narrative layer.
They are fighting the marketing campaign of the machine. They work to counter stereotypes, increase accurate, boring, normal representation in media, and shift public perception.
They're trying to systematically dismantle the fear and disgust by exposing the public to the reality of the demographic.
And finally, the activist and disruptive groups. Historically, the most famous example would be a group like ACTUP during the height of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and 90s.
These groups operate on the fundamental principle that working politely within the system layer is sometimes too slow, especially when lives are actively being lost.
When the government is ignoring a plague, you can't just file a lawsuit and wait 5 years.
Disruptive groups use direct pressure, street protests, civil disobedience, and sometimes highly provocative disruption to force the issue into the public eye and accelerate change when institutional actors stall.
And what's absolutely crucial for the listener to understand here is that these different types of organizations don't always see eye to eye. The lawyers of the policy groups often clash with the activists in the streets.
Far from it. This raises an important point about internal tension. The text notes a perpetual, ongoing philosophical debate within the community itself. The strategy of assimilation versus the strategy of radical expression.
Break that tension down for us.
It's a debate over how to survive. Do you focus on assimilation, proving how normal and unthreatening you are to the majority so they finally accept you and change the laws?
We are just like you. We want to get married and pay taxes.
Or do you focus on radical expression, unapologetically expressing your difference and forcing the system to expand to accommodate you rather than shrinking yourself to fit the system?
This is a wide spectrum, and different groups and individuals operate on entirely different ends of it.
Which proves the ultimate point. Recognizing this internal diversity, the arguments, the different strategies is the absolute key to seeing through this historical propaganda.
When you see that a targeted group has conservative members who want to assimilate, progressive members who want to protest, lawyers in suits filing briefs, and radical activists in the streets demanding immediate change, you realize they are not a coordinated monolithic threat.
They are just a complex human population trying to survive a machine. Once a group is visible, they organize to influence the systems affecting them, and they argue about the best way to do it, just like everyone else on Earth.
Exactly. Recognizing that mundane complexity neutralizes the extreme amplification loop. Once you see the ecosystem, you can no longer be tricked by an algorithm into thinking one provocative video represents millions of diverse individuals.
You have broken the spell of the narrative layer.
We've covered an immense amount of ground today. Let's pull all of this together and look at the blueprints of this engine one last time.
We started with this idea of a machine, and what the source document has painstakingly shown us is that prejudice is absolutely not static, and it is not a random emotional wildfire.
It is a highly adaptable, meticulously engineered, self-reinforcing machine built for one primary purpose, to protect a society's perceived social order, alleviate its internal anxieties, and maintain its rigid categories.
It operates through narratives that trigger primal fear, systems that normalize and bureaucratize the cruelty, and justifications that make the majority feel righteous about their compliance.
It survives by constantly updating its language, from Roman status to religious sin, to state crime, to medical illness, to national security threat, to cultural panic, while keeping the exact same payload of marginalization.
It's a sobering, heavy realization to see the architecture laid out so clinically.
But the document doesn't just leave us with despair, it leaves us with a final challenge, a way to look at the deepest structural vulnerability of this machine. And I want to leave you, the listener, with this final provocative thought to mull over.
We've established today that the historical prejudice machine runs entirely on the fear of ambiguity.
It runs on the existential terror that rigid societal categories like gender roles, family structures, and identity scripts might be fluid or constructed rather than absolute laws of nature.
The targeted group represents that terrifying instability. So consider this. If a society were to simply become comfortable with the unknown,
If human beings stopped being terrified of fluid identities, if we accepted that ambiguity is a natural part of the human experience rather than a threat to the cosmos,
does the centuries-old machine of prejudice finally run out of fuel?
if you remove the psychological demand for absolute, rigid certainty, does the supply of prejudice simply collapse?
It's a profound question. Does the engine finally stall because we stop feeding it our own fear?
We want to thank you for joining us on this complex, extensive deep dive into the architecture of history. It's not easy material to sit with, but understanding the blueprints is the very first step to making sure the machine doesn't keep running on autopilot in our own minds or in our own communities.
Keep questioning the systems and the narratives around you. Keep looking past the viral extremes that algorithms feed you.
And remember, just because the chassis changes doesn't mean the engine is new. Until next time.